The rain didn't just fall. It hammered against Virginia's skull, competing with the relentless ding of the delivery app that had dictated the last 14 hours of her life. Her green uniform was a wet weight against her skin, and her pink backpack felt filled with lead. When the black luxury sedan cut through the fog, she didn't check the license plate. She only saw the promise of a heater and a seat that didn't smell like cold French fries. She climbed in, the heavy door sealing out the roar of the city with a vacuum-tight thud. Inside, the air smelled of expensive sandalwood and something sharp like cold iron. Virginia was too far gone to notice the man in the crisp white button-down watching her with the stillness of a statue. To her, the shoulder she leaned on was just a soft place to end the day. To Jae-hyun, she was a neon-green intrusion in a world of black and white violence. As her breathing leveled out into a deep sleep, the dramatic irony hung heavy in the silent car. She had finally found the comfort she was looking for, but she had found it in the arms of the one man who could make her disappear. The weight of her head on his shoulder was light, yet it felt like an anchor, grounding Jae-hyun in a way he hadn't experienced in years. In the rearview mirror, his driver's eyes met his, a silent, lethal inquiry. One nod and the woman would be dragged from the vehicle and left on the rain-slicked curb. Jae-hyun didn't nod. Instead, he adjusted his posture slightly, not to push her away, but to steady her. He watched her. Up close, the invisible nature of her life was written in the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the way her fingers remained curled, even in sleep, as if still gripping the handlebars of a bike or the handle of a heavy delivery bag. Her green polo shirt was a jarring neon intrusion against the sterile black and white world of his custom interior. She smelled of damp asphalt and the faint citrusy scent of cheap dish soap, a stark contrast to the cold metallic tang of the life he led. He found himself mesmerized by the rhythm of her breathing. In his world, sleep was a tactical retreat, a shallow state of readiness. Her sleep was a total surrender. It was a vulnerability so absolute it felt like a provocation. "Find her address," Jae-hyun commanded. His voice a low vibration that barely stirred the air. The driver tapped a sequence into the dash. Virginia's phone, still clutched in her hand, glowed with the delivery app's interface, displaying a humble apartment complex 3 miles away. The car glided through the storm, a silent predator moving through the shadows of the city. When the car finally hummed to a stop in front of a flickering street lamp, Jae-hyun didn't shake her. He simply waited. The sudden lack of motion did what the engine's roar could not. Virginia's eyes fluttered open, dark and disoriented. The transition from peace to panic was instantaneous. She bolted upright, her gaze darting from the leather seats to the man sitting beside her. Her breath hitched as she realized the expensive gravity of her mistake. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice thick with sleep and terror. "I thought." The app said a black sedan. "You're home," Jae-hyun said, his expression unreadable. His eyes never leaving hers. She didn't wait for another word. Fumbling with the door handle, she grabbed her insulated green bag and scrambled out into the downpour, her sneakers splashing into a deep puddle. She didn't look back. As the car pulled away, Jae-hyun's gaze shifted to the seat she had occupied. There, tucked into the footwell, was the light pink backpack. He reached down, his fingers brushing the smooth fabric. It was light, holding the meager essentials of a woman who lived by the hour. "Sir?" the driver asked, glancing at the bag. "Should I toss it?" Jae-hyun's thumb traced the zipper, his mind already calculating the next move. "No. I'll be returning it myself." The silence of Virginia's studio apartment was deafening, broken only by the frantic drip of her raincoat in the kitchen sink. She reached instinctively for the strap of her pink backpack to pull out her charger, but her hand closed on empty air. The realization hit her like a physical blow, turning her blood to ice. A bag. It was still in that car, the one with the seats that felt like a sanctuary and the man whose presence had been a cold, beautiful weight. Panic surged sharp and jagged. Her ID was in that bag. Her spare keys. A small, battered notebook filled with sketches and the mundane tally of her tips. To her it was her life, To a man like him, it was a map. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in shallow hitches. He knew where she lived. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, unconscious and leaning against his shoulder. The city was full of predators, but he hadn't felt like a common thief. He felt like something much more permanent. A sudden, heavy thud resonated through the door. It wasn't a knock, but the unmistakable sound of something being placed firmly against the wood. Virginia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the peephole. The hallway light was flickering, casting long, distorted shadows, but she recognized the silhouette instantly. Jae-hyun stood there, his dark overcoat damp from the lingering mist, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. He wasn't moving. He was simply waiting. She unlatched the deadbolt, the metal screeching in the quiet. When she pushed the door open, the air in the hallway seemed to rush into her cramped room, bringing with it the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain. The pink backpack sat on the floor between them, looking absurdly bright against the stained carpet. "You forgot this," Jae-hyun said. His voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to settle in the small of her back. I was going to call the car service," she lied, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't have found me there." He stepped forward just an inch, but it was enough to force her to look up. In the dim light, the sharp planes of his face were predatory, yet his eyes held a dark, magnetic pull that paralyzed her. The air between them thickened, charged with a sudden, violent shift in pressure. Virginia felt a frantic urge to bolt, yet she found herself leaning into the space he occupied. There was a dangerous, unspoken chemistry in the way he watched her, not as a victim, but as a curiosity he wasn't finished unraveling. "Why bring it back yourself?" she whispered, the question catching in her throat. Jae-hyun's gaze dropped to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. The corner of his lip quivered in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "I wanted to see if the fear in your eyes matched the peace I saw in the car." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and vanished into the shadows of the stairwell, leaving her standing in the doorway, clutching the bag that now felt like a heavy pink tether to a world she was never meant to touch. The transition from desperate gig worker to high-priority courier happened with the clinical precision of a surgical strike. Within 48 hours of the backpack being returned to her doorstep, the neon green polo was retired to the back of Virginia's closet, replaced by a wardrobe of muted, expensive silks and a leather messenger bag that smelled of rich earth and old money. The offer hadn't been a request. It was an arrival. A sleek, silver-haired man had appeared at her door with a contract for Aurora Holdings, a legitimate logistics firm under Jae-hyun's sprawling umbrella. The salary was obscene, enough to clear her debts and fill her fridge with things that didn't come in plastic wrappers. All she had to do was deliver sealed, heavy envelopes to addresses that didn't appear on standard maps. At first, the thrill of financial oxygen masked the scent of the trap. For the first time in years, Virginia didn't wake up with a hollow ache in her stomach. She moved through the city with a new sense of purpose, her transit no longer a frantic race against a timer, but a composed walk through glass and steel lobbies where doors were held open for her. However, the luxury soon began to feel like a gilded shroud. The first time she noticed the black sedan was outside her favorite bakery. It was the same model Jae-hyun had used, though the plates were different. A day later, she saw a man in a razor-sharp charcoal suit standing by the fountain near her afternoon drop-off. He wasn't looking at his phone or a watch. He was looking at her. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. Whether she was catching the subway or entering her apartment, a shadow followed, discreet, silent, and immovable. "Is there a problem?" Virginia finally snapped, whirling around to face a man in dark glasses who had trailed her for 3 blocks. The man didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflink, his expression a mask of professional indifference. "Mr. Kang's orders, Mississippi. Your safety is a high-priority asset. We are simply ensuring your environment remains controlled." The word asset chilled her more than the rain ever had. She wasn't just an employee. She was a possession under guard. The money, the clothes, and the high-end courier work were the walls of a cage she had walked into willingly. Jae-hyun wasn't just giving her a job. He was colonizing her life. Every time she checked her bank balance, she felt his thumbprint on her soul. She was no longer invisible to the world, but she had never felt more trapped. He had turned the entire city into his personal waiting room, and she was the only one in it. The steam from the bowl of spicy miso did little to thaw the cold dread that had become Virginia's constant companion. She had chosen this diner precisely because it was cramped, grease-stained, and tucked into an alley too narrow for a black sedan. For 20 minutes, she had actually felt alone. Then the bell above the door chimed, and the humidity in the room seemed to drop. Jae-hyun didn't wait for an invitation. He slid into the vinyl booth opposite her, his tailored suit a jarring intrusion against the cracked tabletop. He looked tired. Not the exhaustion of a man who had worked a double shift, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been holding up a crumbling ceiling for a decade. He gestured to the cook, and a second bowl appeared moments later. "You're supposed to be at the safe house," he said, his voice stripped of its usual razor-edged authority. "I'm supposed to be a courier, not a prisoner," Virginia countered, her hand trembling as she gripped her chopsticks. "You're men. They don't even let me breathe." Jae-hyun unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled back his sleeves to eat. As he did, the fluorescent light caught a jagged silver line of scar tissue that ran from his wrist and disappeared under his watch. It wasn't a clean surgical mark. It was the remnant of something violent and desperate. He followed her gaze, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he stared into the swirling broth of his ramen. "I built a world where nothing is left to chance, Virginia. I thought if I controlled every variable, I would finally be free of the chaos that gave me this." He gestured vaguely to the scar, and for a moment the boss vanished. In his place was a man who looked utterly suffocated by the very empire he had constructed to protect himself. "You're just as trapped as I am," she whispered, the realization hitting her with more force than her fear ever had. He looked up, and the magnetic intensity was back, but this time it was tempered by a haunting vulnerability. "The difference is I built my cage. You were just unlucky enough to be standing in the doorway when I locked it." They sat in silence then, the only sound the rain drumming against the glass and the low hum of the refrigerator. The dangerous chemistry was still there, pulsing between them, but it was now laced with a mutual, tragic understanding. He wasn't her captor because he wanted to be. He was her captor because he didn't know how to exist without a grip on someone's throat. And as she watched him eat, Virginia realized with a sinking heart that the most terrifying thing wasn't his power. It was the exhaustion she shared with him. They were two ghosts haunting the same machine, looking for an exit that didn't exist. The walk from the diner to the waiting sedan was a blur of cold rain and the heavy silence of words left unsaid. Jae-hyun didn't speak as he opened the door for her. His movements stiff, as if the weight of his cage had physically settled onto his shoulders. The driver pulled away from the curb, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of his expensive cologne and the lingering, earthy heat of the ramen. Virginia looked out the window, watching the neon signs of the city smear into long, bleeding streaks of light. The illusion of a normal night, a shared moment of vulnerability, was already beginning to dissolve back into the reality of his world. It happened at the intersection of 4th and Main. The roar of a high-powered engine cut through the quiet, followed by the rhythmic, deafening crack-crack-crack of semi-automatic fire. The rear window didn't just break. It disintegrated into 1,000 glass diamonds that rained down on Virginia's lap. "Get down!" Jae-hyun lunged across the seat, his body a heavy shield over hers. Another volley of lead punched through the doorframe, the metal groaning under the impact. The car swerved violently, tires screaming as the driver fought to maintain a line through the chaos. A sharp, guttural grunt escaped Jae-hyun's throat, and he collapsed against her, his weight dead and terrifying. "Jae-hyun!" Her voice was a high, thin reed. The motorcycle sped off into the rainy darkness, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Virginia pushed herself up, her hands slipping on the smooth leather upholstery. Beneath him, a dark, hot stain was spreading across his charcoal suit, turning the fabric a deep, wet black. She didn't think, she reacted. She reached for the leather messenger bag on the floor, the one filled with the high-priority documents of her new life. She shoved the heavy, stiff bag against the jagged wound in his side, leaning her entire body weight into it to stem the flow. The expensive parchment inside, meant for boardrooms and offshore accounts, began to soak up the blood of the man who had hired her to carry them. He looked up at her, his face ashen, his eyes searching hers with a flickering, desperate clarity before his head rolled back against the seat. The safety he had promised, the men in suits, the armored glass, it had all been a fragile lie. The world hadn't become safer when she entered his orbit. It had simply become a more beautiful place to bleed. The golden cage was shattered, and the shards were now buried deep in both of them. The sedan screeched to a halt in the shadows of an alleyway 2 blocks from her apartment. The driver didn't ask questions when Virginia gave the address. He only looked at the rearview mirror, his eyes reflecting a grim understanding of why a hospital was out of the question. Between them, Jae-hyun was a heavy, shivering weight, his breathing a ragged melody of pain. Her apartment felt smaller than usual as she shouldered him through the door, a cramped sanctuary of mismatched furniture and old books that had never seen a man like him. She lowered him onto the narrow bed, the springs groaning under the sudden intrusion. The air in the room was stale, but it felt safer than the open road. With trembling hands, Virginia stripped away his ruined shirt. The fabric was glued to his skin with drying blood, the charcoal wool now a stiff, dark shroud. She moved with a clinical focus she didn't know she possessed, cleaning the jagged furrow along his ribs with warm water and the last of her clean towels. The wound was deep, but the bullet had passed through, leaving behind a trail of raw, angry flesh. As she worked, the silence of the room became a heavy, living thing. The high-stakes power he usually radiated had bled out on the leather seats of the car, leaving only the man. He watched her every movement, his dark eyes clouded with fever and something far more dangerous: gratitude. "Why didn't you let me go?" she whispered, her fingers grazing the edge of the silver scar on his wrist as she bandaged his side. "You said I was just a variable, a piece of the cage." Jae-hyun reached out, his hand damp and cold as he cupped her jaw. He pulled her closer, forcing her to abandon the safety of her task. "Variables don't bleed for the people they hate, Virginia." The distance between them vanished, not with a gentle pull, but with the frantic gravity of two people who had nearly lost the chance to breathe. When his lips met hers, the taste was metallic and desperate, a collision of salt, iron, and the raw adrenaline of survival. This wasn't the polished transaction of an employer and his courier. It was a reclamation. In the dim light of the studio apartment, the boundaries of her old life and his violent world finally dissolved. Every touch was an anchor, holding them steady against the storm that was surely coming. As she leaned into him, the scent of rain and blood still clinging to them both, Virginia realized she wasn't just hiding him from his enemies. She was hiding with him, two ghosts finally finding a home in the wreckage of a single shattered night. The dawn light was unforgiving, stripping away the soft shadows of Virginia's apartment and replacing them with the sterile, cold marble of the syndicate's inner sanctum. Jae-hyun stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his office, his hand resting gingerly over the fresh bandages beneath his bespoke suit. The scent of her, vanilla and rain, still lingered in the creases of his memory, a sharp contrast to the smell of ozone and expensive tobacco that permeated this room. The heavy oak door clicked shut. Min-ho, his second-in-command, didn't wait for permission to speak. He stood at a distance, his face a mask of disciplined concern that bordered on a threat. "The elders have been asking about the delay in the last shipment," Min-ho began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And they've been asking about the woman you've been keeping in the shadows. They aren't blind, Jae-hyun. They know you spent the night in a tenement in the Canning district." Jae-hyun didn't turn around. "She's a courier. A variable I'm managing. She's a liability," Minho countered, stepping forward into the light. The black girl is a distraction. To the family, she represents a leak in the hull, a vulnerability they can't afford while the streets are this volatile. They see the way you look at her, the way you protect her. It makes you look weak. The air in the office grew thin, the tension of physical weight between the two men. Jae-hyun finally turned, his gaze like obsidian, his expression unreadable despite the heat of his anger. I don't take orders on who I keep in my bed, Minho. This isn't about your bed. It's about your blood, Minho snapped. The council met this morning. They gave an ultimatum. They want to ensure your loyalty hasn't been compromised by a passing fancy. They demand she be eliminated. To prove that you are still the man they chose to lead, you must be the one to sever the tie. Permanently. Jae-hyun felt the wound in his side throb, a rhythmic reminder of how she had saved him. Her hands steady as she stitched his broken skin. The syndicate was a machine that ground up anything it couldn't control, and now its gears were turning toward the one person who had made him feel human again. He looked at the burner phone on his desk, the silent link to Virginia, and realized that the very shadows he had used to hide her were now closing in, driven by the men he called brothers. Proof of loyalty was written in blood, and the syndicate was thirsty. He had survived the bullet, but the politics of the family were far more lethal. The intimacy of the apartment felt like a fever dream by the time the next summons arrived. The burner phone buzzed against the bedside table, a jagged intrusion into the first real sleep Virginia had known in weeks. Jae-hyun was still healing, his breath steady against her neck, but the mission was absolute. A high-priority drop near the old canning district, the message read. No delays. The warehouse was a cavern of rusted iron and salt-stained concrete at the edge of the harbor. As Virginia stepped through the heavy side door, the silence didn't feel like security. It felt like a held breath. The recipient wasn't waiting at the designated crate. Instead, the rhythmic metallic click-flick of a lighter echoed from the darkened rafters. He's more sentimental than we gave him credit for, a voice rasped from the shadows. A man stepped into a thin sliver of moonlight, but he didn't reach for the bag she held. He reached for a radio. She's here. Signal the bait is set. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, leaving her breathless. The bag didn't contain documents or illicit cargo. She could feel its lightness now, its hollowness. Her presence was the only currency being traded tonight. She wasn't the messenger. She was the lure, the one thing guaranteed to draw Jae-hyun out of his fortress before his wounds had even closed. Fear turned into a sharp, cold focus. Before the man could move, Virginia swung the heavy, empty bag at his face and bolted. She didn't head for the main road where their cars would be waiting. Instead, she plunged into the labyrinth of the canning district, a world of narrow gaps between brick walls and hidden drainage tunnels she'd mapped during 100 midnight runs. She was a ghost in the machinery of the city. She squeezed through a gap in a chain-link fence that led to a forgotten courtyard, then dropped into a basement passage that connected two parallel streets, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could hear the heavy boots of men behind her, their shouts muffled by the thick fog rolling off the water. She knew every dead end, every loose brick, every shadow that could swallow a person whole. But as she emerged into a rain-slicked alleyway, the roar of a familiar engine tore through the night. A black sedan skidded around the corner, its headlights cutting through the mist like twin blades. The door flung open before the car had even fully stopped. Jae-hyun stepped out, his face a mask of pale fury, one hand pressed hard against his re-bleeding side. He looked at her, not as his employee and not as his variable, but as the only thing left in the world he couldn't afford to lose. The trap had sprung, and as the first shots rang out from the warehouse behind her, Virginia realized that being the bait meant she was finally, irrevocably part of his war. Jae-hyun did not wait for the syndicate to strike first. The ultimatum delivered by Minho was the final spark needed to ignite a fire that had been smoldering since he first met Virginia in that rain-slicked alley. He didn't just walk away. He dismantled the architecture of his own power. By the time the council realized he had betrayed them, The mainframes were melting, and the offshore accounts that fueled their operations had been bled dry into the wind. He ushered Virginia into the car as the first sirens began to wail in the distance, a mournful chorus for the empire he was burning to the ground. He didn't look back at the black smoke rising over the city skyline. His loyalty was no longer for sale, and his blood belonged only to the woman beside him. They hit the open road as the clouds broke, a relentless deluge turning the world into a blur of gray and silver. Virginia sat in the passenger seat, her eyes bright and vigilant, scanning the side mirrors with the practiced precision of a survivor. She was wide awake, her heart a steady drumbeat in the quiet sanctuary of the car. She had spent her life as a variable in other people's games, but tonight, she was the reason the board had been flipped. Jae-hyun gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, but the internal storm that had defined his existence had finally passed. The weight of the crown was gone, replaced by the simple, grounding reality of the road ahead. The wound in his side was a dull ache now, a reminder of the price of his freedom. "Where to?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the hum of the tires on the wet pavement. "Somewhere they can't find us," he replied. As the miles stretched between them and the ghosts of their past, Jae-hyun felt a profound stillness take root in his chest. He was the driver, the one steering them toward an uncertain horizon, but the exhaustion of 1,000 battles was finally catching up to him. With Virginia there, watchful, alive, and free, he didn't have to be the monster anymore. In the heart of the storm, as the rain washed away the soot of his old life, Jae-hyun finally found the rest he had never believed he deserved.